This week, we are changing things up, and instead of reviewing a fund, we'll be focusing on the rules multi-managers use to evaluate managers' skills. So, Kirby, set the scene.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it's be interesting, kind of just to kind of review some rules. I mean, Anne and I have, we kind of worked together in a past life, and we both still in the multi-manager space, or Anne is just kind of, Anne is actually more in the research space at the moment. But I think it's important. She
researches what managers do.
Yeah, not anymore. I'm up here. I'm in the cloud lands.
But I think it was kind of, we could kind of look at some of the rules and some of the things that we do as multi-managers in order to evaluate skill and understand managers in the South African space. And I mean, a lot of this stuff is kind of what we saw internationally. If you look at your screen right now, you'll see that most multi-managers in the country use what we call a two-factor evaluation model. They look at both qualitative and quantitative factors, and they are exactly what they say. Qualitative factors are those factors that you kind of pick up when you visit different manager houses. They are factors that you potentially see when you visit a specific asset manager. And quantitative factors is kind of trying to understand returns and the different extrapolations of returns. And maybe more importantly, if you kind of had to understand the philosophy that a manager has and the process that they have, how those two kind of fit together and how the returns kind of get generated from them. And what you're trying to achieve is, if you look at that next slide up there, the typical evaluation structure, you're trying to go through a whole bunch of things. You're trying to look at people, and you can see some of the things that you're kind of looking at the screen there. The investment process, very, very important. The business, support, performance, and obviously portfolio structure as well. You're trying to tick the boxes, and then you're trying to say, how appropriate are these returns? How good are these returns, and how appropriate are they for use within a multi-manager structure, potentially with other managers, and not necessarily on their own. And what you're really trying to achieve is you're trying to achieve upside, but with fairly limited downside when there is going to be downside. I mean, and is that kind of, have I coherently and succinctly kind of put what we've kind of been doing for quite a long period of time?
Well, maybe I'd describe the quantitative part a little differently. I think people get confused that the quantitative is just sort of looking at historical performance. The key issue of quantitative is that you want to see when a manager tells you he's doing something, when a manager tells you he did well, when a manager tells you this is his philosophy, can you actually quantitatively see that in the performance? And that's what you're looking for. You're not looking for good performance. You're looking for whether or not the manager is actually doing what he says he's going to do. And that's where I think the quantitative comes from.
Okay, well, what he says he's going to do, and hopefully what he says he was going to do is going to be beating his benchmark and beating the market.
Well, there might be good reasons.
Getting good returns.
There might be good reasons why managers don't beat benchmarks, because benchmarks aren't necessarily perfect, as Roland always says.
Yeah, and we know,
and we can talk about that until the cows come home. Yeah. And he's not here, so he can do it much better than I can. But and I think Anne's making a classically good point there. Is that when we go back in time and we look at returns for managers, often what the manager thinks works in a portfolio and what actually works in a portfolio or doesn't work in a portfolio are sometimes quite different. Once you've actually run a whole bunch of quantitative screens, you've actually understood returns, often you go back to the manager and say, do you know that these are some of the big drivers in your portfolio? Do you understand that you inherently have maybe taken a currency bet or or a bet? And sometimes managers look at that and they go, wow, I didn't know that. I'm actually exposed to the currency and I never knew that I was exposed to the country. And there's some horror stories as far as that's concerned, where managers have actually been utilized in portfolio constructions and where potentially, trustees were left, kind of in the dark as far as these things are concerned.
But your point about beating the benchmarks is exactly the point that we're trying to redress. Because just because a manager beat the benchmark has absolutely nothing to do with manager skill. So what the quantitative process does, what is skill in a manager?
So then why embark on even looking at a benchmark?
You don't. Remember, what a multi-manager is doing is that it's recognizing the different managers will come in and out of viability in the market at different points in time because of their investment philosophy.
I like calling them yardsticks.
Okay.
It's one yardstick.
And what should the yardstick be? The overall market, I mean, there's so many. We know that these benchmarks are starting to become really sophisticated, where it's 10% of a specific index and 10% in cash and 10% of property, and it creates this benchmark.
There's a benchmark, remember the Reg 28, there's a benchmark that helps you understand, am I actually still on my path? Am I performing well in line to my funding requirement? There are other ways of looking at manager skill. Benchmarks are not the way to look at manager skill. That's what I think we're saying. And I think Kirby, who's much more of a qualitative person than I am, more of a quantitative, would probably agree with that. Benchmarks are a lousy way to look at manager skill. So the trick is, how can you use techniques, both on the qualitative and quantitative stuff, that take that benchmark out of the equation and try to extract some insight as to whether you're looking at skill or not.
Yeah, and I think that's important. And I mean, often when you look at the quantitative stuff, it's often very, very important to look at the quantitative stuff, get a picture of what this manager is about, and then being able to go and actually do a due diligence. And the worst thing from a qualitative perspective is when you do a due diligence is to actually sit down and ask a manager to actually go through a presentation. That's the worst thing you can do. The best thing for you to do is to actually ask him questions, ask him things that you want to know, and walk around. Walk around, get a feeling for the place, get a feeling for who works there, the kind of culture that they have, how people trade, how people make decisions for portfolios. And often those things are much more telling than potentially just looking at a presentation.
Very quickly, closing comments, Anne.
Well, I think that the absolutely important point here is to think not that we're out there picking manager skill, and if we just pick all the skillful managers, we're fine. When you're building a portfolio of more than one manager, the key issue is not do I have the most skillful manager, but does this team of managers actually blend together to give me a significant sustainable outperformance. So looking at one manager by themselves is only, maybe a quarter of the equation. Looking at how the whole thing comes together is going to be key.
Yeah,
fantastic.
absolutely.
On that very high note, thank you so much to both of you for joining us. Great to have you on the program.